Welcome everyone today to our eBECS webinar. The topic is Outbound Warehouse Management in AX 2012, which is some pretty cool, exciting new features that came with the R3 release. Today it's my pleasure to introduce Andrew Linksek. He's one of our senior consultants here at eBECS, and he's going to be presenting the content today.
Thank you, Charlotte, and welcome everybody. So first off, just an introduction to eBECS as a company. We are a total Microsoft Business Solutions provider globally. So we have offices here in the US as well as in the UK and other parts of the world. You can see we're a gold Microsoft partner in BI, ERP, which would be the NAV and AX products, as well as CRM. We won the 2015 Microsoft Dynamics Reseller of the Year award in the UK, as well as many other years preceding to that. Another award we've won is the 2015 Inner Circle. That's only the top 2% of partners Microsoft welcomes into that group, so that's a really important one that we're very, very proud of. As you can see, we specialize in the ERP, CRM, BI, as well as managed services in the private and public sectors. We are a total Microsoft provider, so it's not only the ERP, CRM, and BI solutions, but you'll also see mobile solutions, field service solutions, and Office 365 as well. Quick introduction to myself. As Charlotte mentioned, I'm a senior application consultant with eBECS North America. I've been in the AX space about 8 years first as an AX end user. I spent many years as a production planner, inventory control specialist before becoming an internal business analyst on the client side, and then about 3 or 4 years ago transitioning to a functional consultant, specializing mainly in production and trade and logistics. So some basic points about today's feature. I mentioned we specialize in a few different areas. Today's definitely going to be around the ERP side and AX 2012, specifically AX 2012 R3. And what we're talking about is the warehouse management solution that was provided, which you'll often hear referred to as WAX, meaning warehousing in AX. So some basic points before we go over the agenda. If you're not familiar with WAX, there's a lot of different features that you need to know about before you can set up this module, and there is extended functionality that goes across inbound order processing, outbound order processing, and internal transfers. Today we're going to focus mainly on the outbound order processing, meaning your sales order picking and packing processes and loading trucks. To do WAX transactions in AX, there's a few things that are mandatory. So your warehouses, for one, must be what's called WHS enabled or warehouse management. And your items also must be WHS enabled, which is controlled in your storage dimension group. So typically that's where you set if you are controlling inventory by things like site, warehouse, location, etc. With 2012 R3 we introduced a new dimension, and we also have a checkbox that says whether or not items are warehouse management enabled to use that functionality. One of the examples I'll give in a few minutes here is license plating. Unless you have a warehouse management enabled storage dimension group, you can't use that functionality. So they're prerequisite setups that are very important before you can begin using this functionality. However, once you implement it, you can have some warehouses, for example, using WAX processes and others that are not. So you don't have to have an all or nothing, 100% full dive into WAX. You can use it as your company is needed. So an example of this might be that some companies don't use the inbound templates or the inbound WAX work. They want to use the traditional arrival overview form for receiving, and then a more manual process for put away that uses the new mobile device menus, which we'll discuss later on. So instead of saying we 100% move all inventory through a mobile device in warehouse management, we actually can have mixed mode environments or different warehouses using different processes if our company requires that. Most of the scenarios that I'll show today are also true for transfer order processing. So while I'll show demos on sales order picking, packing, and truck loading, those same things can also be done for internal transfer orders when you're shipping between warehouses within the site. And then lastly, an important point is the WAX or warehouse management module closely integrates with the transportation management or TRAX module to provide rating, routing, and load planning with your carriers and your customers, and that can be both internally and externally. So we won't get too much into TRAX today, but it is important to note that there is functionality that ties those two closely together. So what's our agenda going to be? First, we're going to talk about the concept of license plates in AX 2012 R3, what they are, what the benefits of them are, and why you would use them. Next, we'll talk about reservation hierarchies, so how items get reserved to sales orders and what options you have. We'll talk about 3 different concepts, shipments, loads, and containers, and what their differences are in AX 2012 R3 and how you'll use them. Then we'll talk about specific setups for waves, work templates, and location directives, which are building blocks of warehouse work. Everything is broken up into work, whereas in former versions of AX you might think of picking lists and packing slips. Here we're really utilizing a concept called work, which is broken up really with those 3 different pieces of functionality. We'll then talk about your picking options. So in traditional picking lists, you kind of just pick an item from a location and you can do transfers to other locations if necessary to post goods out. We'll talk about the various options you have to move goods through the warehouse as you pick them for sales orders. We'll also talk about the options of releasing that work to the warehouse. So instead of sending picking lists to a warehouse worker, how you can release this work to either individual workers or queues for the warehouse to juggle their load of work from. And then lastly, we'll talk about mobile device menu options, because at the core of this WAX functionality is really intended to use mobile devices. So things like RF scanners or even the mobile device that's inherent in AX. So for now, I actually have everyone on mute just so we can continue with the presentation. If you have any questions, feel free to enter them into the text box, and I'll open it up at certain points for you guys to ask me questions on specific topics, and we'll come back at the end as well to address any concerns or questions anybody has. So first off, what is a license plate and why is it important? And I really decided to include this slide because I've done a few implementations recently where customers had never used a warehouse management system before. So license plating was kind of a foreign concept to them. And license plating in warehouse management in AX is really the core building block of all the functionality. So what license plates are, they're unique IDs that can be barcoded and assigned to a pallet, a location, or a forklift. So the main really thing to understand is they pretty much supplement or replace what used to be a pallet in the old WMS2. So now instead of pallets we have what's called license plates. I mentioned earlier the storage dimension group controls if an item is warehouse management enabled, and there you would actually have a checkbox to say is the item use license plates, just like you would if you are controlling an item by site, warehouse, location, and inventory status. Why these are useful is where inventory needs to be tracked at a more granular level than a location. So if, I put a couple examples here where in a receiving dock you would license plate an entire pallet of incoming goods, and then your users would know what inventory came from what shipment, because your license plate would be tied to the shipment or load that those goods came in on, and you can use things like directives for putting them away. A common example of really license plates is, let's say you pick 100 items for a sales order, and then you now want to go move those to a goods out area. Instead of picking each individual item, you can actually scan a license plate and move that entire load of goods all at one time. So it really makes the warehouse processes a lot more efficient by allowing you to match in AX what you physically do out on the shop floor if you were using pallets or license plates. The license plates are integrated with AX 2012 R3 Warehouse Mobile Device and other functionality in the Warehouse Management module, which we'll see later. And the other piece that's important to note is specific location types must be license plate controlled. So where I said you can have a mixed mode environment, that doesn't mean that license plates will not be used. There are specific location types, which I'll show later in the demo, called user locations, staging locations, default receiving locations, packing and goods out that must be license plate controlled, whereas your standard storage locations, for example, where you store your inventory, do not necessarily have to be license plate controlled. But depending if they are or not, that might change what your process is. Next, we have a reservation hierarchy. So in former versions of AX, you might have manual or automatic reservations, for example, and you're really perhaps only providing reservations at your coverage plan level, so maybe site and warehouse, but not location or serial number. What a reservation hierarchy does is allow us to apply whatever reservation scenarios we need either at time of the reservation on the order or choose those different dimensions at time of picking. So what I mean by that, for example, is you could reserve just at the site or warehouse level when you're reserving on a sales order and say that you would only record the location, the license plate, and the serial number, for example, as you're picking. Alternatively, you could have a serial or a batch number higher in the reservation hierarchy, say above location, which would mean that you'd actually have to specify a serial number or batch number on the sales order reservation, and then when the warehouse went to pick it, they would be looking for those specific serial and batch numbers. So it really depends on, what level you need, you can adapt to. If you need to pick that serial number and batch number specific to a sales order, you can. Otherwise, you leave those at the bottom of the hierarchy and allow the warehouse to just scan whichever serial number and batch number they need. The next concepts we'll talk about are shipments, loads, and containers. So these can be easily confused, so I thought it was beneficial to just have a few simple definitions. A shipment is a group of sales orders for the same customer or for the same destination. A load would be a set of sales orders or even a set of shipments that are grouped together and typically going out on a single truck, rail car, or other mode of delivery. So for example, we might have 100 sales orders that need to go out today. Maybe they're split up into 40 or 50 different shipments depending on customers or destinations, but they're all going to go out on the same FedEx truck. We could actually combine those into a single load to track that load all in one go, and then have the shipments and sales orders obviously tracked to the unique IDs of orders. Containers are a little bit different, so I thought it was important to include these in this slide rather than just defining what's a shipment and what's a load, because a lot of people hear containers and they think like a C container. They think of what in AX would be a load. A container in this essence is really just a physical structure that the products are packed in. So if you were using a packing bench and you wanted to record what boxes an item were going into, those would be containers. And you can set up as many container types as you want with various dimensions like height, length, width, or volume or weight limitations. So then that way when you're packing in AX, you can actually say what items went into which container and then print out forms that say what's in each box if you need those for customs purposes or for delivery notes. And then just a few small notes. A load can have one or many shipments, and a shipment can have one or many sales orders. So that might be obvious per the descriptions above, but it's just an important note because some companies decide to do a one-to-one relation and others rather have it split up with many shipments in a single load. And then the main difference with these concepts as opposed to previous versions of AX or non-WAX AX is the posting of pick slips. In the old AX would be really through a stock management picking list and registration or by posting a pick list directly from a sales order. Here we're actually going to be in the warehouse management module or using warehouse management processes and releasing work to the floor, although you can have configuration that allows you to update a picking slip as work is processed through warehouse management. Next we have waves, work templates, and location directives. So these all tie together to basically specify what the flow is going to be in the warehouse. So how goods are going to be processed when they're picked, packed, and shipped. So first you have waves, and these can be set up to run by batch jobs or run manually during release to warehouse processes. And basically all these waves do is they group picking work that's created for multiple work orders into one group so they can be released at once. So you would have many orders, many different picking work IDs. They could be for 50 different sales orders, but you could actually end up releasing them through a wave to the warehouse all at the same time rather than releasing order by order. So it's a little bit similar to batch jobs for posting picking lists as you would see in previous versions. Then you have your work templates. So these define the sequence that work is going to go through and how items and orders are grouped together for picking work in the warehouse. So what I mean by that, for example, is maybe we have a very simple warehouse structure. We're going to pick goods from their storage location and then post the packing slip or close out the work and say they're shipped, we would define that within the work template. Each work template has pick and put steps as well as other steps that we'll get into that will dictate that. Other companies, they might have a more complicated set of rules in their warehouse. Maybe they pick them from their location, then they move them to a packing bench or a staging area to consolidate with other goods, either on the same order or other orders, and then they're going to take the goods from the stage out area and ship them from there. Work templates is where you define that sequence of what you're going to do in the warehouse and what your workers are required to do. Within work templates, we have a few different things. We have what's called work classes, which control which menu items can process the various pick and put transactions. So I'll show an example of that later. We have work pools. These are basically just filters to organize work in a group. So if you've ever worked with like production pools or purchase pools, it's a very similar concept there. It's more for filtering and reporting purposes. We also have custom work types. So I mentioned that typically you have your pick actions and your put actions. So picking is really picking an item up, and putting would be moving it to another area. Custom work types allow us to actually, with standard AX code, do special transactions in the middle of those, in the middle of that work. So for example, maybe there's a special data capture where I have a warranty number I need to capture that's not really inherent in AX or validated, but I need to capture it as I pick the goods. I can put in a custom work type to allow me to do that. So I can show you an example of that during the demo as well. And then we also have work priorities. So you can assign default priorities for work templates, or you can manually assign priorities. So that's very useful for when work is what I'll call system directed, which we'll talk about when we get to the mobile devices. System directed, basically, as users log in to RF scanners to process work, they would actually be told exactly what to do. They don't have to start with the scan of an order. So with priorities, you can say start the order with the highest priority first. So it's very kind of, simple to understand, but it's very flexible in terms of allowing you to dictate what types of work should be done first and what type of work is not as urgent. And then last we have location directives. So instead of having like default receiving and default shipping locations on items, we now have the ability to kind of define a sequence of how the system should look for where to pick items, where it should put items if they're going through staging locations, and even for shipping outbound orders. So we have all these different options with location directives to use strategies to say where should this item be picked from, what locations does it need to pass through, and what location should it ship out of. And we do this by having a location profile, which one says which locations are license plate controlled, which I mentioned earlier, not all locations have to be license plate controlled, whether those locations can be cycle counted, whether they allow mixed batches or inventory statuses within them. So if you don't want to mix an item from multiple batches in the same location, you can have a configuration in AX to not allow that if that's important for you in like process industries, for example. And you can also define location stocking limits. So if you have a lot of size restraints that you want to manage in AX, you can do that with location profiles. Location types, those are just a type of warehouse location. So you can set up a type for all staging locations, a type for all receiving locations, a type for all standard storage locations to segregate those locations by a unique type and use reports for those. And then finally, you have your location directive actions and strategies. So this allows us to define the strategy for directing users through locations for the warehouse. So for example, I put a few titles here, consolidation. What that means is if that is your strategy for your location directive, it's going to search to see if there is on-hand inventory in that location. So it's actually going to tell you consolidate with the inventory that's already in this location. So it's actually going to search for locations where there's inventory instead of going alphanumerically, for example. And then we have other strategies like license plate guided or empty locations with no work. So one example I'll show later is some clients want it to first look to see if there's other inventory we can consolidate with, and if there's not, then see if there's any other locations that don't have any inventory, for example, or is there a fixed location for an item, meaning is there a primary location that you set up in the system. We can define that with the location directive strategies. Next, we just kind of have a simple process flow to tie all those concepts we just mentioned together. So the first process would be the creation of the wave, and like I said, that could be manual or that could be automatic through a batch job. Once the wave is created, we can add shipments or loads to the wave, and depending on how that wave was created, that step could technically happen at the same time. Then the wave is processed, and when the wave is processed, it should create the work if you're doing things uniquely. So there's a box here that says verify the work, no. What that would mean is if no work was created, that wave should remain open and process again or canceled because perhaps there were some errors in your process. If there wasn't and work was created correctly for the warehouse, that wave would then come into a status of released, and finally you can see work would be available on the mobile devices so the warehouse workers could then go and start to pick against the sales order transactions. So once that work is released to the warehouse, like I said earlier, there's going to be various picking options you could have depending on what your physical process is in the warehouse. So I'm just going to mention a few of them here. Simplest and most straightforward example is straight to goods out. So what I mean by that is you don't do any consolidation, or you don't want to do that in AX itself, so you don't stage the parts in a separate staging location. You don't bring them to a packing bench in AX. So when items are picked from their storage location, they're then immediately put into a goods out location, which would basically be in an AX world loading onto the truck. So if you don't really have long packing times or a long period between when the items are picked and when they are actually shipped out, that's kind of your most simple example. Then we would have staging. So this would be where you are taking goods into a temporary holding area to consolidate them, perhaps to pack them, or maybe you're picking parts a week ahead of time from where they're actually shipped. That's when you would want this intermediate staging location so you could pick them from their storage location and leave them in this kind of temporary holding bay before you actually go and do the pickup to load the truck. So it allows you to kind of segregate that inventory so it can match the timing of your physical process in the warehouse. And then a third option is packing. So this is what we call containerization in AX, which could be manual, where you're basically saying this item goes in this box and so on, or automatic. Automatic would allow you to set up those container types that I mentioned before, and as goods go through picking, they would actually automatically be placed in a box if you had dimensions set up in AX. So if all your items had length, width, and weight, for example, and all your containers also had those dimensions set up, what would happen is as work is created, it would search to find the correct containers that would physically fit those items and just automatically pack them in there. So if you're not really managing a physical packing process and you don't want to place the goods into a packing location, you can use automatic containerization to still have that feature to track goods by a container ID. And then there's just a few optional setups here that are really helpful. One would be work exceptions. So if you ever have instances where something goes wrong, work exceptions allow you to meet various scenarios. One example of this is a work exception called short pick. So it's very common. You're in a warehouse, you're told to pick something, and it's not there. So maybe your inventory was off, or maybe for some reason it's just not in the place it should be. You can have a short pick option that says the user would short pick. They would define the quantity they actually picked as opposed to the quantity that they were expected to pick, and it would actually cancel or close out that line. So if I were expected to pick up 2 items and only 1 was there because it reserved 2 but our inventory was off, I could say short pick, I only picked 1, and if my company desires, I can actually have that automatically trigger a cycle count. So I can keep that process manual, or I can keep it fully integrated in AX to automatically trigger other warehouse processes. Another work exception would be location overrides. This is common on inbound put away, for example, where it directs me to one location, but maybe I know it wouldn't fit there, or it should really go to a different location and there was a wrong configuration. I could override the location and say I'm going to put it somewhere else, which is another thing that commonly happens in the warehouse. And then a last picking option that I thought was unique to to let you guys know about is full. So full basically splits work. So the example I gave is I'm going through picking work and I have 10 items to pick and I'm halfway done and all of a sudden it's the end of my shift or I have a meeting and I really need to pass that off to somebody else or close it out. Now, if I were to just back out of the transaction, it would leave the inventory in limbo. It would basically say it's at my location. Say it's at a Lensac, which is a virtual location. It's really just what happens when I'm moving goods. So what we would really want to do is we'd want to click full that says, I'm done picking the items I've picked, and the rest of the items on this pick need to be split off into a separate ID so I can either process them later or have somebody else pick up that same work ID and continue to work on it. So it allows us to leave those work IDs not in a state of limbo, but actually split them up to physically what's happening in the warehouse. Prior to all that work being released, you have the option to say how should work be released to the warehouse. So I listed really 4 different ways. So there's manually from a sales order. So you'll see when we get an AX, there's a button on a sales order header that allows us to release work to the warehouse after it's been reserved to the sales order line. It's very similar to posting a picking list from a sales order. We also have manually from the release to warehouse form. So in the new warehouse management module, there's a form called release to warehouse, and it shows all open sales order lines as well as if the inventory has already been reserved to them, what their address is, what customer it is, etc. And you pick which lines you're going to release, add them, and then release them all in one go. So this is very similar to if you're familiar with the old release sales order picking form, where you'd have a big form with lots of information on it to, instead of going one by one, you can actually release many orders all at the same time. We also have a load planning workbench. So if you needed to build a load first, let's say you had 5 sales orders, they were all going out at the same time on the same truck, you could build a load to include all the lines that are going to be on it and then release work for the load from there as the inventory becomes available. So it's a little bit more of a manual process, but it ensures that the load ID is set up front so you don't have to do consolidation in the warehouse after the fact. And then we also have a batch job. So this would be similar to any other batch jobs in AX, that batch jobs can automatically release work to the warehouse based on selection criteria. So you'll have the ability to define fields that are on the sales order, fields that are on the item, fields that are on the customer, for example, and dictate what gets released to the warehouse and when. So if you need to release work in like waves, for example, where you need to do all priority work in the morning and all same day in the morning, and then anything that's like international that's going to go the following day, or anything that's an intercompany order that is not as urgent, you can have those on a separate batch job that run later in the day. And through all of these, we can also use what's called fulfillment rates, which are defined either per legal entity or customer to say either a value threshold or a quantity threshold that needs to be reached on a sales order before goods can be released. So instead of, for example, releasing an entire line of 5, if you can release 2 of the 5 as they become available, you can use fulfillment rates for that option. And then lastly, we have our mobile device menus and items. So this is actually the setup of what the workers would see, what buttons they would see in the mobile device, and what options they have. So it was functionality designed to work with virtually any mobile device that meets a minimum set of requirements, and that's basically a Windows interface, like a Windows browser, for example. This is provided through a browser interface, so really, like I said, almost any gun can do this, whether it be an Intermec gun, a Motorola gun. There are many options you have. They really don't matter as much because the configuration of what's in the mobile device will all be done through that browser interface rather than through the hardware itself. When you're setting up the mobile device, you really have one of 2 decisions to start. You have what's called indirect, which are indirect activities that you do in the gun. Inquiries, for example, looking up on hand of an item, looking up locations, looking up a display of open work. So you're not actually processing anything, you're really just looking to find information. Log off, for example, adding the log off button would be an indirect option in the mobile device. And then we have work, so that's all the things the users are actually going to be doing, processing sales orders, processing loads. Those would be set up with a different option, and then once you decide that it's going to be work, you can basically say, is there something I need to do to create the work, or was that work created, for example, during the release to warehouse process? So when orders are released to the warehouse, it automatically creates work. So there's different configuration for work that's already created versus work that you have to create. For example, on purchase orders, you create the work by first scanning your purchase order number if you are receiving those goods. And then we have directed by, and this will all make sense in a minute when I get into the demo. Directed by is basically saying, if you are processing work in a mobile device, if the warehouse worker needs to go in and perform a transaction, what should the option be for how they log into that transaction? So these are the options they have. System directed would mean you have a set of fields that you can configure, and you're going to set a sequence. So I gave the example earlier of priority. It's going to search for whichever work ID has the highest priority, and as soon as I click on the button in the mobile device that work ID would exist in, I would automatically be logged in and told what item to pick, where to pick it from, what the license plate is, etc. So that's like a fully automated option to take any real decision making out of the warehouse worker, as opposed to user directed, which would be, I'm going to log into a specific menu, maybe sales order picking, for example, and it's going to expect me to scan a work ID. So I would have this huge queue of work IDs, just like I would have picking lists. I'd say, I'm going to start this one now. So that's a little bit more of a manual approach, but it's very flexible in terms of what a lot of companies do in their warehouse. And then we have a few other options, for example, user grouping, to group many work IDs into one transaction and process them all at once, cluster picking, cycle count grouping, etc. So next, we'll go into AX, and we'll actually put a lot of this to the test and show you guys where this setup lives, and then process a few transactions in the mobile device. And then really quickly, before I do that, I'll just unmute everybody and see if there's any questions so far. Any questions on the slide deck so far? Okay. So now we'll actually go into the AX client. I'll be using a demo environment here, and you can see here I'm automatically already in the warehouse management module. So with AX 2012 R3, the main two modules we've talked about today that were added in, as you can see here in my navigation pane, if I just expand it, would be warehouse management and transportation management. So a lot of the old features that you would have done your warehouse management work in would have been in your inventory or stock management module. Now we're working out of warehouse management. So very briefly, we'll just walk through some of the setups that control all this. So as you can see in warehouse management, if I go down to the setup, there's a whole section for warehouse setup. So you actually end up setting up your warehouses in the warehouse management module instead of the old inventory management module. You'll find those old menu options there, but you're going to set up any WAX enabled or WHS enabled warehouses in this module. And the main difference you're going to see when I open this form is really this whole section right here. So you can see there's warehouse management, and the first checkbox that controls all of this functionality is, does this warehouse use warehouse management processes? So I'm just going to pick this one called WAX here, because that's the one we're going to do today's demo in, and you can see that that checkbox is checked. So right away I know that that warehouse is going to be set up differently than maybe a return warehouse, for example. And we have more options that are only available if this first checkbox was selected. If it's not, I can't use anything else in this tab. Then we also have the locations that we would set up for them. So before you set up locations, I mentioned you have your profiles, your location types, you have location stocking limits. You would set that all up before creating the locations themselves. So the location profiles, for example, here is where you say if it's license plate controlled, if you allow the mixed inventory statuses, batches, and so on, and you can set up your dimensions for location stocking limits. And then lastly, really quick before we actually start processing some transactions, is you have your item setups. So if I go to the product information management module and I bring up my release products, there's going to be certain fields on these items that have to be selected if I want to use any of this great WAX functionality. So you can see I only have a few items set up here, and I've named them so that they're very easy to pick out in a demo: WAX 2, 3, and 4. And similarly to what we had in the warehouse, we're going to have a new fast tab on the item. I'll just expand my form here, called Warehouse Management. And there's a few mandatory fields on this item if the dimension group specified that the item was warehouse management controlled. So your dimension groups that are assigned, your storage dimension group, the most important one that I mentioned earlier, I'll just briefly navigate to that. You can see here, this is where you specify if that storage dimension group uses warehouse management processes. Once that's checked, it would introduce the license plate dimension to add that as you see fit. And then any item that uses that dimension group is going to have a few mandatory fields within this warehouse management tab. There's the unit sequence group ID. So if you have goods that are in different units, eaches, boxes, pallets, different various dimensions, you could have different unit sequence group IDs. You would also have the reservation hierarchy, which would be next to your dimension group, and that reservation hierarchy once again is going to define which dimensions must be reserved when you place the reservation on the sales order, or which ones can be left out of the reservation and just recorded as you pick the goods. So for example, my default one here, there's no batch or serial number because this item is not batch or serial controlled. So as you're setting these up, you'll see if you had selected an item that had batch and serial control and you try to assign a reservation hierarchy that doesn't include those two dimensions, you would get an error. So I have a few different reservation hierarchies depending on that scenario. Here's one with batch above location, which would mean I have to reserve a specific batch ID to the sales order before I can release it to the warehouse. Otherwise, if I left it at the bottom like this, then I could reserve just against site and warehouse and have the warehouse worker just scan whichever batch they pick as they actually go and pick the items. So that really depends on your business requirements which way you want to set those up, but it is a mandatory field for WAX items. Once you have your items in your warehouses set up, that's when you would set up all of those building blocks that I mentioned. So back in the setup module, we have our location directives, and I'll just briefly show you an example of these. Here's 7 different directives I have. First is picking. So you can see there's a work type, which is always going to be a pick or put step, and it's picking from the storage locations. Then I have a put step because my goods actually go through a staging area. So it says, now direct these towards a staging location. So every time you have a pick or put transaction, you define quantities that are acceptable if you allow splitting of work and different settings like that, and then you have the location direction action, which allows you to specify those strategies I mentioned. So if you want to consolidate goods into a specific area, or if you don't want to have any strategy and you just want the user to decide the location, you can leave those open and apply queries if you need to filter by location types or sequence them in a specific order. You can do that. So I have, like I said, 7 here. I have pick from a normal location, put to staging multi, which means if I'm picking up multiple items on a work ID, I need to process them all in one go. I need to make sure that I have the exact same setup for an individual item and multiple items at once. I then have the pick action from a staging location, same thing for multi, and then putting to goods out from staging. So I basically pick from storage, put to staging, then pick from staging and put to goods out. So that's what the location directives allow you to do. If I were to show like an inbound example, we don't have the purchase order set up, but you would set up location directions and location directive actions to say how are these items being put away and what location should we use. So that's the location directives. Then we have our work templates, and our work templates say what is that sequence that these items go through. So with mine, I first have my pick. I then have a custom step. So I mentioned custom work types, where if you have something that's unique to your business, that you just need to capture data at some point in that process, you can put in custom work types here. So mine's a warranty serial number. It's not something we track in AX. I just want the warehouse worker to record this so I can go and look it up if needed later on. It doesn't tie into like the serial number form in AX. It's special data capture that I wanted to do after they pick items. Then there's the put to the staging, pick again when I actually go to load the items, and put onto the goods out. So that work templates defines that sequence, and you'll always have at least one pick and one put action, and that last line always has to be a put action. And then finally, the other setup we talked about was your mobile device menu items. So here is where you decide, is this menu item, for example, change warehouse? This one's indirect. I'm not processing anything. I'm just doing an inquiry, for example. So my mode is indirect. Same thing with an item inquiry or a location inquiry. Whereas with picking, if I go down to sales picking, you can see my mode is work, and I'm using existing work.
Muted. Unmuted.
When I'm using existing work, that's because it's released to the warehouse and the work is created, and then I'm going to be either scanning it or have the mobile device actually log me into it. So you can see here my direction is user directed. So I'm going to show you one of the more simple examples of what happens when we release work to the warehouse. The order I'll process is actually already released, but I'll show you very briefly where those release steps would happen. So we'll do the most basic one first, which is similar to, like I said, posting a picking list from a sales order. So I'll go into sales and marketing. You can see here there's a release status, so it actually tells you if any items have been released to the warehouse yet.
Muted. Unmuted.
So we can see there's 2 sales orders that are open, a few that have been released already, and some that have been partially released, meaning some of the lines have been released already and some have not. If I needed to release any of these after a reservation takes place, so say for example this very first order, I would come to the warehouse management module and click release to warehouse. So that would do a few things. It would create a wave, shipment, and a load depending on my configuration and release the work to the warehouse. So that's very similar to going into, confirming my sales order, then going to pick and pack and posting a picking list. But with warehouse management, instead of that picking list, we have the release of work. If you wanted to use any of the other options, that'd be in your warehouse management module. Here is your release to warehouse form, which shows me all my open lines, and you can see I can choose between sales orders and transfer orders. The item number, the item name, its status, and the quantity available to release. Basically all that means is this line has already been reserved, so you can release it to the warehouse. If it is 0, that means no reservation has taken place against the quantity on the line. So we could use this form to choose which lines we're going to pick and filter on any of these fields that are available, delivery name, city, state, etc. And then we also, in the periodic section, have the batch job that I mentioned. If you wanted to take all of the manual work of posting and releasing to the warehouse out of the picture, you can use this batch job to say automatically release these sales orders, and you can do that based on either what's physically reserved, or if you choose all and have a checkbox set on your warehouse, it would actually do the reservation for you and release the work all in one go. And here's where you would define your selection criteria. So you could say limit what you're going to release through the batch job. Some companies have lots of items that are very simple and need to be released in batch, and they want to kind of handhold other items or other warehouses. So like I mentioned, I already have it set up where my work has been released, and I can see that if I go to my common work form, I'll have all work here. So here's all the open work that I have set up in my demo environment. You can see they're all sales orders, so these are all orders that are going to be picked, possibly packed and staged before loading the truck. And anytime these are open, they should be available in the mobile device. So the mobile device, what I'll have to do for the demo, since I don't have a physical scanner in front of me, is I'm going to open up my AOT to access the form that this would be normally accessed by in a browser. So what would happen when you're implementing this is you would basically set up the browser interface by a technical consultant so that you could log in into a mobile device and actually process this work, just like I'm going to do here. So this is basically a simulator of what you would see in your mobile devices. A lot of times what companies will do during early stages of the project would be they add that form as a link right in the warehouse management module, so you don't have to go into the AOT and retrieve it. You can just log directly into it in AX. And you would have a user ID and password. You do not have to have an AX account for every user, so you could basically have one default warehouse account, but then against that warehouse account create many warehouse workers, so they all have their own separate login and IDs. So you could basically have one license, but 100 warehouse workers all with their own mobile device IDs. And then you'll be presented with your menus. So right now it opened up to the last menu I was in, which was Outbound, because I clearly didn't log off correctly. But what would typically happen is you'd be presented with a main menu based on your configuration, and you would choose what type of work you're going to be doing. So in my case, I'm going to Outbound work, and I'll be doing sales order picking. As you can see, when I click that button, it's immediately saying scan a work ID or license plate ID. The reason it's doing that is because my mobile device menu is set up to be user-directed, because it wants me to decide what work I'm going to process. I have the knowledge, maybe my warehouse manager told me which work IDs I should process. Whereas if this was system-directed, instead of saying scan work ID, it would actually tell me the exact item, exact license plate I need to go pick. So that's the main difference between those two. Is user-directed is more of a manual thing, whereas system-directed, it's logging you in based on a predefined setup. So what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to process this last work ID. So I'm just going to enter the work ID number, which would be done typically in a warehouse by a scan. So you could print out the work forms just like you would a picking list, and you'd scan that work ID. This next screen is an optional one. It can be a summary to tell you how many picks are you going to do, the total quantity units, and the total weight. It's up to you if you want to display that screen to users first. I like it because it kind of lets me know what work I'm about to process. You would then click OK, and it's immediately going to say, here's the first item you should go pick. So if I had many items on this work ID, I could have defined a sequence to say, take me in a logical flow through the warehouse, so I'm going to location 1 first, then 2, then 3, then 4, and so on. In this case, I have one item, so it's just telling me what location that item is in, which I've asked the system to allow me to confirm those locations as well as the item and quantity. So here's where you'd scan your location, you'd scan your item number barcode, and you'd confirm the quantity. If I entered any of those wrong, so for example I enter a location of 005 and click OK, it's going to tell me that location ID is not valid because it's actually directing me to 0004. If I knew for a fact that the item was not in location 004, I get there and the system might think it's in 004, but it's in 005. Here's where I can do my override and specify which location I'm actually going to pick from. Or if there's nothing in 0004, I can do my short pick and allow the system to cancel out that work so we can go and check stock and release the work later on when it's physically there. In this case, I'm going to imagine everything's all well and good, correct warehouse, correct item, correct quantity, and I'm just going to process these. You can see here there's some text. This is unique to the item. There's what's called a warehouse mobile device description. So if, for example, the actual item description is not good enough, or there's like a unique note that you need to always pass for this item to the warehouse worker, you can set this up on the item so it actually passes through special text every time you pick that item, which is why we're seeing this here for this item. So now I've entered my correct location, my correct item, my correct quantity. I click OK. Everything was good, so it processes to the next work type that was set up in my work template, which in this case is put to staging 1. You can have more confirmations here like I did on my pick action where you can say scan location scan license plate, scan item if needed. Otherwise, it would just tell you where to go, and you would click OK, and you'd see work completed. So if I go back into AX right now and I refresh my screen really quick, we can see the work status has changed to in process, and if we look down at my lines, the pick and put from its storage location and put into staging have now been closed, and all I have left to do is pick from staging and load the truck. So if that was an immediate thing, I could go and do it right now, but in many cases, maybe a day or two has gone by, and now I need to go and load the truck. That's actually going to be done in a different menu option. So I had sales order picking to do the initial pick, and then I have what's called sales order loading, and these names can be anything you want. I configured them to be very simple ones, but when you set up the mobile device menu, you would name these options whatever makes the most sense for your business. So if I select sales loading, I get that same option of am I scanning an ID or am I being automatically logged into one. In this case, I'd scan my work ID, and it's immediately saying, okay, on that work ID, you're at location staging 1, here's your license plate and item. And once again, if you needed confirmations on that information, you could have those there. In this case, I don't. And I would say, okay, so I've now picked it, and it's telling me where to go. Now, if I were to stop here, and I just refresh my screen really quick, you can see down in my lines, all the first 3 have been closed and the last one's in process. So this is where I was talking about where if I left this and I just go off for the day, if I were to look at an on-hand form, it's going to show up in a location named after me, because right now I started a pick and I never finished it. So the product's in limbo and it's going to say A Lensac. So you never really want to do that. If you're not going to finish it, you either need to not start that transaction or use that full option that I mentioned earlier on to say, I'm done with the items that I needed to do and I want to split off the remaining items. So you would never really want to leave it in a status like this where it's in process and at the user location. So for now, I'm going to actually finish out this process. I'm going to say yes, put the goods out. I'll confirm my item, my location, and my quantity, and click OK. And we'll see my work has been completed. So if we go back into AX and refresh this screen again, you can see it disappears off of my queue or my all work form. But if I wanted to see it, I can say show closed work, and it would show me all work that has been completely closed or canceled. After that's been done, that inventory is now out of AX, so it's effectively shipped. However, with WAX, each work ID is going to be assigned to a load or a shipment. So to actually effectively ship the goods and process the load, you would want to confirm the shipment or go to the load and confirm the load. So if I confirm this shipment, which I can do right from this form, you can see the shipment for load has been confirmed. So that allows me to actually process the work. So say like this was one work ID, but imagine on that load there was 5 different work IDs. When I confirm the shipment, I'm confirming that I've shipped all of those goods on the shipment, and I produce whatever paperwork is necessary at that time. So it segregates the picking and packing process from that confirming the shipment. So you have the ability to look at goods in all different types of areas. That's a very basic flow of how that will all work together in AX. Like I said, you could have custom steps. You can see on one of my closed work orders here, I had to have a custom step for my warranty serial number, and any of those staging, packing locations, those are all also optional, whatever your business requires. So for now, after I've gone through that basic demo, I'll unmute everybody and see what questions there are, or if there's any other scenarios you want me to show during today's session.
I had a question about shortages.
Okay.
So, for example, you mentioned that typically when you link a sales order to a work ID, you have that option where you have you can change, you can override a quantity. Is there a way, if, for example, as a warehouse manager, I accept a shortage for a sales order, how would I reconcile that in this warehouse management process?
Right, so what would happen basically, so I'll just pick out a work ID so we can try to make a relevant example of this rather than just talking about it. So let's say we imagine I'm going to pick this item, item number wax from location 0004, and it wasn't there. In my mobile device, I would have selected short pick. What that would do, if I selected short pick, since this one's only a quantity of 1, I'd have to say my pick quantity was 0. So it would actually cancel out the remaining transactions for that item in this work ID, and then depending on configuration, you can either have that cancel that item from the load that it was on, and which would basically mean that you'd have to go and redo everything from scratch. You could have it automatically trigger a cycle count, so that as a warehouse manager you are basically have a cycle count work. So just like I had shipping picking work there, I would have now cycle count work to go to that location and count the item. But as far as the order itself, it's a fairly manual process. So if all I did was short pick that quantity, the sales order line's still open, and at some point I still need to fulfill that. So if, let's say I did short pick and then we did our cycle count and there happened to be no inventory there and I cancel it down, well obviously we'd have to remove our sales order reservation. And that can be done manually or through a checkbox. And then eventually when the stock comes back into inventory, I'd have to re-release it to the warehouse. So we'd have to re-release everything to the warehouse.
Okay, so it would be a manual process.
Yeah, it's a pretty manual process.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Was there another question? I thought I heard someone saying hello. Okay, it sounds like I guess either that person didn't have a question or they're no longer on. So if there's any more questions, let me know. Otherwise, we can stop the recording and call it a day. Okay, I want to thank everyone for taking the time to come today, asking any questions, and just wanted to provide you some contact information. If there's any additional questions that weren't covered or you want to do follow-ups or attend other eBECS events, you can reach me at alensek@ebecs.com. You can go to our website at www.ebecs.com and go to the events page as well to see what other upcoming webinars we have.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.